Hello everybody. Welcome back. Today, I wanted to confront the hard truth that usually comic book movies aren't like amazing pieces of cinema. I've got a couple theories as to why it's hard to adapt comic books to movies specifically, and I wanted to talk about them and, develop the theory a little bit. Let's get thinking, everyone. Let's go. First, medium. The obvious and primary, one might even say foundational reason that comic books are tricky to adapt into films is just due to the difference in medium. Comic books are serialized, whereas movies are standalone narrative experiences. Because of that, comic books adapt a lot better to television than they do to film, because both mediums are serialized. So for something to be serialized, that means it comes out in regular installments, like comic books, TV, radio shows, or even like narrative podcasts. And by virtue of that medium, serialized stories just have a lot more time to develop their characters and establish complex plots. The rising tension of the story is drawn out so that the climactic installment feels really gratifying and earned. That means that you can build up to these like crazy comic booky stakes in a way that is hard to translate to movies, because the audience's suspension of disbelief and investment in the characters is already so high. The real benefit of telling a story over a period of time is that the reader is spending a lot of time engaging with the fictional world and its characters, both in terms of like narrative time in the story that elapses as it goes on, but also in terms of like real life downtime. In between issues, in between installments. In between issues, fans are actively thinking about what's going to happen next. They're rereading older issues or rewatching older episodes, and a lot of fans are creating or engaging with fan content. People are thinking about the thing and thinking about the characters and writing what they're doing and stuff like that. So this, like, real life downtime is actually essential to fandom creation, which I've been thinking about writing an essay or doing a video about. This is what I meant by the suspension of disbelief and the investment in characters being generally higher in serialized mediums. The serialized nature of comic books means that climaxes, like crossovers, big story beats, big events, those things are really impactful because of not only the narrative buildup over several installments, but because of the real time in between those installments that all builds up to this big moment. Conversely, comic book movies often kind of suck because the big plots that are tapped to be the movie source material are these climactic events that need all this buildup. Movies, like I said before, are standalone narrative experiences in which the same buildup payoff narrative system that's used in serialized media is simplified and concentrated down into one self-contained story. Think about something like the death of Gwen Stacy. That was such a powerful moment because part of serialized media is that you can drop in and watch an episode or read an issue and follow what is happening because serialized media maintains a status quo at the end of each issue. The death of a principal character subverts that expectation more and more powerfully as more issues continue on with the new Gwen Stacy-less status quo, for example. It's the same with Jean Grey dying at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga. The fact that the book continued on without her is precisely what makes that story so iconic. In a movie, on the other hand, a character dying tends to be less impactful because we've only known that character for like an hour maybe, and the movie is going to end within an hour or less, normally less, of their death. So it's the same with a lot of these big comic plots. The reason that they are iconic within the source material is because of their impact on the comic book status quo, something that is nearly impossible to replicate in film. The MCU did try to replicate this. The key to the success of Phase 1 was really the simplicity of the MCU. It was not a world full of superheroes, it was a world with 3 superheroes. The whole early appeal of the MCU was that it was a relatively easy way to get into these otherwise extremely convoluted and often contradictory comic book stories. The thing is, though, that structuring films in this way directly contradicts the aspect of movies as a medium that they are standalone narrative experiences. This is why the later MCU has felt way more like a TV show or something like that than an actual like film series or even individual films. So that ends up making the audience treat the MCU like serialized media, except instead of the installments being short comic issues or even like a 20 or 40-minute TV show, we're talking about movies with runtimes of over 2 hours, whole seasons of shows on Disney Plus. So audiences are like so fatigued from this, myself included. I have completely and totally tuned out from the MCU. I think maybe not being a teenager anymore had something to do with it, but I don't know. Generally, audiences are only tuning in for like these big status quo shaking events like Infinity War and Endgame. But really the reality of the MCU at this point is that with those two movies, Marvel effectively used up all of the payoff that they had been building up to. Like they can't replicate the success of Phase 1 because there haven't been any strong solo movies that they can then base a team-up movie around. The MCU cashed in all of its momentum with Infinity War and Endgame, and that's why you see their next big status quo shaking movie that audiences are interested in seeing is Fantastic Four, which seems to kind of be serving as a soft reboot for the MCU. So at the time of recording this, Fantastic Four has not yet been released, so I haven't seen it and can't really say how much of a soft reboot it actually is. I have a sneaking suspicion that Fantastic Four isn't actually going to be a soft reboot, and that it's just going to continue to follow the MCU formula. I think that the reason that audiences are ultimately fatigued of the MCU formula is because it totally disregards something that I'm going to call narrative core. So I've established that you can't really one-to-one adapt comic plot lines into film well because one medium is serialized and one medium isn't, but obviously there's a way to create strong comic book movies, and I think what sets a good comic book movie apart from a bad comic book movie is whether or not it preserves the character's narrative core. Think about it this way: if you're not adapting a plot because comic plots don't adapt well to film, then what are you adapting? You're adapting the core components of the character or the team. So in Japanese studies, kara is a term that is used to describe the core foundational aesthetic traits of a character and how they preserve their visual identity across different mediums. But I actually want to expand that concept a little bit to talk not about the foundational aesthetic traits, but the foundational narrative traits of some iconic comic book characters. I think that narrative core can be boiled down to 3 big ideas that need to remain intact for an adaptation to work, as in successfully adapt the source material. And note that adapting source material successfully is different from making a good film, although they do play into each other. These 3 ideas are setting, core appeal or core character appeal, and theme. So usually, since the best comic book movies tend to focus on and adapt like solo heroes, that's what I'm going to focus on right now. To illustrate narrative core, I'm going to break down 2 very popular solo heroes, Spider-Man and Batman. Let's do Spider-Man first. So, Spider-Man's setting is New York City. New York City is an iconic setting that grounds Spider-Man in reality. It was like a real setting that the writers were in, so they're able to include like real places and real landmarks, which then makes Spider-Man feel a little bit more real and makes him a little bit more relatable, which is very key because of Spider-Man's core appeal. Spider-Man's core appeal is that Peter Parker is relatable. So, Spider-Man was one of the first, if not the first, teen superheroes. This is a big deal because they might seem ubiquitous now, but despite comic books mainly being marketed towards adolescents, most heroes were like adult power fantasy moral figures that could be like positive role models, essentially. Stan Lee had the very genius idea to make the hero of a book marketed to adolescents an adolescent and be relatable. The tension of a Spider-Man comic comes from Peter Parker struggling to balance his hero life, Spider-Man, with his high school life, with dating and getting MJ to like him and later getting a job. In a Spider-Man comic, dealing with a bully is just as important as stopping crime. The core appeal of Spider-Man as a character is his relatability to the audience. This is not to say that Spider-Man does not also serve as a moral figure, because obviously the core theme of a Spider-Man book is with great power comes great responsibility. Thematically, Peter Parker starts fighting crime after the murder of his uncle and the incompetence of the police. Spider-Man isn't interested in riches or fame. He wants his community to be safe. He wants the streets to be free of crime. This makes Spider-Man an even better moral figure than the adult heroes because it's inspiring that you don't have to wait to adulthood to enact positive change on the world. You can enact positive change now as a teenager. It's nice. So, to adapt Spider-Man in a way that preserves the narrative core of his character, a Spider-Man movie needs to be set in New York City, contain relatable adolescent or young adult emotional drama, and connect to the main theme of standing up for the little guy and doing what's right. Conversely, let's look at Batman. Batman's setting is Gotham City. So Gotham City is a bit of an allegorical representation of the modern American big city. It's dark, it's dirty, the crime rates are off the charts. It's relatable in a sort of blanket way, allowing many different people, not just people from New York City, for example, to relate to living in Gotham City. So the core appeal of Batman is actually that Bruce Wayne is a power fantasy, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all. The trauma of losing his parents in a random act of violence makes Bruce Wayne relatable to those who feel wronged by modern society or random crime and also want vengeance. What differentiates Bruce Wayne from being relatable from being a power fantasy is the fact that he is rich and successful, and he masquerades as Batman so as not to lose his wealth. His capital and lack of superpowers are specifically what make him a power fantasy character in a way that not every superhero directly is. Theme. Batman's theme to me is that he is the world's greatest detective. As the world's greatest detective, Batman is, he solves mysteries and works with the police. He takes out criminals. This is a really firm angle for him to take. It's like an anti-crime, a hardline anti-crime stance. And because of that, it can be questioned by his adversaries and the reader on a, ideological basis. Sometimes you don't want your character to do what's morally good. You want their convictions to be strong, even if those convictions are misguided. So therefore, a good Batman movie needs to be set in Gotham City, have power fantasy revenge action, and morally gray theming, like noir detective theming, as a result from Batman's being the world's greatest detective. This is why I personally thought that Pat-Bat worked so well, because even though that film doesn't perfectly retain the power fantasy aspect of Batman, the choice to forego the power fantasy element was made to emphasize the noir theming of the film. Like most hard-boiled detectives get emotionally invested in their case, they have these emotionally fraught pasts, and moreover, a lot of hard-boiled detectives and noir stories at the end, they're unable to save everyone. I think that the choice to sacrifice a very comic booky element, the power fantasy, for film noir elements and hard-boiled themes end up making a much better film, even though it isn't a one-to-one perfect adaptation. This is kind of what I meant by making a good adaptation is not the same as making a good film, even though they do tie into each other. Adaptation isn't an exact science, and different viewers will have different reactions to adaptational choices made by filmmakers. I could see somebody to whom the power fantasy aspect is the appeal of Batman not liking Pat-Bat, and I actually think that's fair, even though I think that Pat-Bat is a really, really good movie. For me, X-Men First Class is actually my least favorite X-Men movie because I don't think it's a good adaptation, even though a lot of people who aren't pre-existing X-Men fans end up really liking the film. So I picked Batman and Spider-Man because they have both spawned successful adaptations, good movies. And I think that those adaptations have been successful in part due to the strong narrative core of the characters and how the filmmaker preserved them. Both books have a very clear-cut set of themes, emotional beats, and story ideas to work with. The minute details hand-waved in adaptations are largely irrelevant, or at least I think so. To me, it doesn't matter if Spider-Man biologically generates his own webs or if he builds web shooters. What matters is the emotional narrative of standing up for the little guy and making up for letting Ben die. The team problem. Superhero teams, on the other hand, often don't have this same narrative core to cash in on in movies. And this is really where a lot of modern comic book movies have started to flounder. So, speaking very, very broadly, there are two types of superhero teams in comic books. There are either teams composed of characters that have their own standalone titles and stories, which are team ups, and then teams composed of characters created for the title, which are just teams. So the Fantastic Four was really the first team book to my knowledge, unless DC had one first that I don't know about. And Marvel actually asked Stan Lee to create another team to follow the success of the Fantastic Four, which was the X-Men. Famously, Lee actually developed mutants as a way to avoid coming up with unique backstories for all of the characters, and the discrimination element wasn't actually included until Claremont took over. Obviously, the Avengers are a team-up book. So team-up books exist really for one reason and one reason only: to sell more comic books. If Captain America is your best-selling book and Iron Man is your second best-selling book, why not put them both in one book and publish all three at once? That way, both fans of the individual characters are buying the team-up and your sales have doubled. So, inherently, team-up books they don't adapt well to film. They're just so, comic booky. The MCU obviously replicated the team-up model with Phase 1, but one of the main reasons that the MCU has really been struggling is that fundamentally, the Avengers exist to sell more comic books. This is really apparent when you try to break down the Avengers narrative core. So what is the Avengers setting? The setting is kind of Earth, because in universe, the only explanation for all of these characters coming together is to counter a villain that has planet-sized stakes. But because of that, that also means that a lot of time, these stories are actually taking place in space. The core appeal of Avengers, like I said before, is that it's a team-up book. So as a team-up book, the emotional beats of the key characters are generally elaborated on in their solo titles and not in the group book. The other appeal of a team-up over a team is that a team-up book can kind of serve as a star maker by teaming low-profile characters with higher-profile ones who have their own books. But this really doesn't have 100% success rate. Mantis is the best example of it failing. And actually, the two characters that benefited the most from the Avengers' star-making potential are Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, who were mutants that were introduced in X-Men. So that's some food for thought. So theme. What is the theme of the Avengers? This one's actually easier than the other one. Earth's mightiest heroes. That's the hook of the Avengers. To translate, this means come see your favorite superhero in a team setting. It inherently relies on the strength of the individual characters to pull people into purchasing titles, to pull people into watching movies, to get people interested in the Avengers as a whole. I know I have just said the same thing over and over, but this is all just due to the book being a team-up. Avengers doesn't have a narrative core in the way that other comic books do, or at least other real teams do, or at least not a very good one. The core identity of the Avengers is just to fight evil and protect the planet, which is the nebulous goal of all superheroes. So it's just not very compelling, and it's not a good choice to base your multi-billion-dollar franchise off of, in my opinion. But of course, the only reason they did that is because Marvel had already sold the film rights to Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and X-Men. So more food for thought. Sorry to keep ragging on the Avengers, but the Avengers fight bad guys. They don't even fight crime like Spider-Man or Batman do. Because like I said, for all of these superheroes to come together, it has to be some crazy high-level planetary stakes like aliens or Galactus or Thanos or whatever. The build-up payoff of a story like that comes from months of foreshadowing aliens in the team-up book and the solo titles that then lead to a big event book. That doesn't really translate to movies well, even though that is the circumstance in which team books are the best. In the later MCU phases, the movies are just bloated with all of these big name characters fighting for lines and screen time. Even Batman movies have tended to crash and burn when Robin is introduced because it's just too comic booky. And remember how panned Amazing Spider-Man 2 was when they tried to do the Rogues Gallery? Or Spider-Man 3 when they tried to do Venom? Some things just don't adapt well. And it's a lot easier to focus in on the narrative core of like just one character, because then you can take a lot of adaptational liberties. When you're working with the team, it's like the more adaptational liberties you take, they kind of have these ripple effects that end up affecting all the characters in a way that can just like totally screw over the ultimate attempt and adaptational strength of adapting a team specifically. So what does this mean? Does this mean that teams just can't be adapted to movies like Solo Heroes? And kind of a little bit. Kind of a little bit. I think that there's definitely a reason that the best comic book movies have focused on just one hero. It's because then you just have one protagonist, one antagonist, one narrative conflict. You don't have to focus on all these different characters and their subplots and where everybody is. You don't have to make it work. It is easier to adapt. But that's not to say it isn't possible. So, as I've maybe foreshadowed, I actually think that X-Men uniquely are the team that is just best suited to being adapted into anything ever. The X-Men are uniquely able to get around a lot of the problems that like teams have, and they're able to maintain the really strong narrative core that solo heroes have because they rely on the audience's knowledge of real-world discrimination and oppression to therefore support plot lines around the mutant allegory, which of course is like the fundamental aspect of the X-Men as we know it today. The mutant discrimination metaphor is what sets X-Men apart from other superhero comics. It is what makes it so culturally enduring and popular, and it is what makes X-Men so good. It's not my point here that all X-Men stories need to revolve exclusively around oppression, but in the case of adapting comic books to movies, where so much background information and world building has to be excluded just due to the difference in medium, the X-Men really benefit from relying on the oppression metaphor to quickly introduce viewers to the world and the main conflict of the story. So, like I said before, Stan Lee elected to have the X-Men be mutants who were born with their powers because he was tired of coming up with backstories. The in-world implications of this and the discrimination metaphor as we know it today wasn't considered or included in the story until Chris Claremont took over the book in the 70s and 80s. Claremont didn't just introduce the oppression allegory to the X-Men, he really committed to it as the grounding conflict of the title. Claremont is the writer that introduced the Holocaust survivor backstory to Magneto. He is the writer that introduced the ideological conflict between Professor X and Magneto, where Professor believes in, nonviolence and tolerance, whereas Magneto's ideology is militant and terroristic. A lot of people regurgitate this idea that Claremont himself was basing them off of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, but that actually isn't true. The mutant oppression allegory has been used as commentary on real-world issues ranging from race to homophobia to eugenics to anti-Semitism to Zionism and more. Its vagueness and applicability is its strength in that it can be understood by a variety of different oppressed people, with no one reading being any more canon than any other. That makes X-Men not only relatable to many different types of people, but also a very valuable didactic tool for teaching children about different forms of oppression. The mutant discrimination aspect is especially important in X movies as it builds upon the viewer's real-world knowledge of discrimination to fill in expository gaps. It positions the X-Men as righteous underdogs, saving people who hate them because it's the right thing to do. It's a very just cause, it's very easy to understand, and it's extremely easy to get into. Think about how the MCU had to spend so much time and so many movies setting up Thanos. In an X-Men movie, you get into X-Men, and the villain is a senator who's trying to pass anti-mutant legislation. That's just so much easier to get into fundamentally, than Thanos or Galactus or anything else like that. Just to exemplify this more, I'm going to break down the X-Men's narrative core a little bit. So the setting is Xavier's School for Gifted Students. Jack Kirby has actually said that after Stan Lee decided that the mutants' powers were going to be mundane and that they were born with it, he thought that a school would just be a natural setting. And he was completely and totally right. Because mutants are born with their powers and then they manifest around puberty, a school setting just is logical. The school combines coming of age drama with superhero stakes by placing all these like pubescent teen characters trying to figure out their mutations and stuff together. It's like the teen drama of Spider-Man, but like a whole school full of Spider-Men. It's a whole school full of Spider-Men, okay? The classic example of like the student character, the relatable character, is Kitty Pryde. But the real beauty of the school setting is that a character that was once a student can then become a teacher, and we can have a new cohort of students. Multiple characters can fulfill each archetype of like teacher, student, X-Man, trainee. So the combination of like teachers and students, or X-Men and trainees, creates this like mentor-mentee dynamic between different characters, which then generates this like very found family vibe. This, of course, is applicable to different characters depending on the era in question. Like the Kitty Pryde archetype, for example, has been filled by like Jubilee, Armor, Magic, X-23 even. Like New Mutants has Magneto take over the school, and Generation X, which is like a book that I really liked when I was a teenager, has Emma and Banshee in charge. My point is just that the school setting is perfect, and it's key to X-Men's, adaptability. It makes total logical sense in the world. We don't have to do these like intellectual hula hoops to think of why all the Avengers are together or something like that. And then the school setting also breeds this crazy emotional drama, because you've got all these teen characters together, and then you've also got these grown characters who are having these messy soap opera style relationships. So you could say that the core appeal of the X-Men is that mutants are oppressed by humans, but that's not really true. The core appeal of the X-Men is actually that mutants are empowered and are able to resist human oppression, and that difference is very key. The X-Men serve as a sort of power fantasy for marginalized groups, in which the mutant characters possess these abilities that they can use to stand up to the imbalanced and relentless forces of systemic oppression, and then actually force and enact radical change. So the way in which mutants should enact this radical change is kind of the theme, if you will. To me, the theme of X-Men is the ideological conflict between nonviolence versus militarism. With this theme, each mutant character, and also the reader or viewer, is able to ideologically locate themselves on the nuanced issue of tolerance versus militarism, as it exists as an ideological spectrum in which Magneto is one polar extreme and Xavier is the other. Magneto, of course, thinks that mutants should use their powerful abilities to force radical change, but Professor X fears that this will incite human retribution and destroy empathy for mutant kind. This is a core theme in a lot of the books, because we always have these endings where, the X-Men save the humans, but the humans still hate them and stuff like that. Or Magneto predicts something will happen and it does happen. This tension is consistently included in the books. Like, what if Xavier is wrong and Magneto is right? This is really compelling, and it's a great theme to springboard off of. The strongest X-Men movies are undeniably focused around this theme. And because the characters are mutants, the conflict is always personal. Mutant extermination would not only be morally wrong, it would directly affect the main characters that we as readers love. That creates inherently much higher stakes and a much more engaging conflict. So when adapting X-Men to film, the strength of the mutant metaphor frees up time in the narrative that then can be used to develop characters and develop emotional stakes in a way that a lot of superhero movies are just completely devoid of. So what can we learn from X-Men? I didn't just bring this up for no reason. So first, adding in relatable, real-world elements and allegories can ground fantastic plots. However, this has to be done intentionally. An example of a real-world allegory that I actually didn't think was done intentionally and I didn't think was done well is actually Superman, which I saw recently. I posted a full review of what I thought about the movie on Letterboxd if you want to go read it. But essentially, I didn't go into the movie expecting Superman's ideology to be questioned, but then the movie ends up questioning Superman's ideology in that talking scene with Lois and Clark. And I was extremely interested in that. Like I said before, I think that including things like that can really ground an otherwise fantastic plot and get audiences to care about the drama that's happening in a way that just doesn't work with stuff like Thanos or for X-Men Apocalypse. Apocalypse is my least favorite X-Men villain. I hate him. Despite the film introducing these questions to its own narrative, they really weren't resolved in a meaningful way. And formally, I didn't think that the way that the film handled the whole conflict, the Baravian conflict, was satisfying at all. I really think that this film may have been stronger if it was cut, which is ridiculous because I just spent half an hour talking about why superhero movies are so much stronger when they do have real world elements like that. Essentially, I think that that plot either should have been cut or that the movie should have been made to focus exclusively on that, and that Superman's story should have been thematically intertwined with that one more so than it was. This again is why I think I liked Pat-Bat so much. The ideological questioning of Batman is very present formally and in the narrative and in the character arcs themselves. And having everything tied together is really key to making an adaptation like this work when you're including all these random bits and bobs that are a part of comic books. So I hope that I have elaborated some reasons that especially the MCU has been failing so bad, why these team movies with all these different superheroes feel so bad to watch. And also, I hope I've given some perspective as to why Disney acquired 20th Century Fox in order to get the X-Men film rights back. Food for thought. So to create a good comic book movie adaptation, you need to maintain the narrative core of the character over any minute details, and you need to generate a plot that is faithful in tone and theme to adaptation, not one-to-one from comic books. These films are very strongly grounded when they have relatable or real-world allegory elements that audiences can relate to, and when they're missing those things, they're just an absolute slog to watch. Ultimately, I do think that the superhero genre has overstayed its welcome. Even though I'm somebody who likes comic books, I think we can call it, to be honest, the thing that I've liked the most recently has been X-Men 97, because it was an animated TV show, and that's just so more comic book than any of these movies. The shift from 2D to 3D, the shift from serialized to standalone, it all just becomes too much for these weak plots to handle, and they just buckle under the weight. At some point, if so much has changed about an adaptation, it's just not the original thing anymore. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope that this was interesting and informative and that this was an actual real analysis. I've got a lot coming up, especially about comic book movies, especially about X-Men. If you want to find more stuff from me, I also write on Substack. I've got something coming out soon about otaku consumption, database consumption. So yeah, just stay tuned. Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing. Bye.